Good evening. I'm Peter Zaleski, Professor of Economics here at Villanova, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to tonight's lecture by Walter Williams of George Mason University. Before we begin, I should take a moment to recognize the people who made today's event possible. First off, for providing funding for tonight's event, we are grateful to the Villanova School of Business, Dean Kevin Clark, the College of Arts and Sciences, Dean Jean Ann Linney, the Department of Economics, Len Mao, Department Chair, the Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering, Ronald Chatterton, Department Chair, and the Matthew Ryan Center, Colin Sheen, Director. Also, we received a grant from the national headquarters of Omicron Delta Epsilon, and they are the International Honor Society for Economics. And I'd like to send out a special thank you to the Villanova Students for Liberty. They're headed by Matthew Oranges and Venus Avellino. And the Students for Liberty, those are the gentlemen out there passing out the programs, greeting you as you came into the Villanova room. Also, I'd like to thank them too for their financial support. They picked up the tab for the printed programs for tonight's talk, so thank you for that. I have one more person to thank, and it's a very important person. Way back, this is last summer, August 11th, I get an email out of the blue from someone I'd never met before. And this person, she introduced herself and said, "Hey, I'm thinking about bringing Walter Williams to campus for a lecture. Do you think there's any interest in the economics department for this?" Make a long story short, here we are. And so, suffice it to say, without the just unimaginable, tremendous amount of initiative shown by Andrea Welker of the Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering, this whole evening just would not have even taken place. And so I'd like to thank her for having gotten the ball rolling. And so it is my pleasure to turn the microphone over now to Dr. Andrea Welker, who will introduce tonight's speaker. Thank you.
Good evening. I'm really thrilled to welcome you all to Villanova tonight, and I'm sure tonight is going to be a very provocative and thought-provoking talk. When I reflected on what brought us here today, I realized that it was, at its core, about two people who are willing to take a risk. Me for reaching out to Dr. Williams out of the blue, and him for agreeing to meet me, even though he didn't know me from Adam. And when I thought about this some more, I realized that this willingness to trust others and this belief in the people being the ultimate resource, to use Julian Simon's terms, is really one of the things that unites people who love liberty. And so with that frame of mind, I invite you to listen carefully to Dr. Williams discuss the legitimate role of government in a free society.
My pleasure to be at Villanova. Again, I haven't been on your campus for a while. Back in the, I guess the late 80s, I used to come here almost every night to the library to do research on the book that I was working on at the time called South Africa's War Against Capitalism. Anyway, I'm pleased to be here again. And now the topic of my talk tonight, or the title is The Legitimate Role of Government in a Free Society. And those of you in the back, there's seats up here. Now, in the course of my comments, I'm going to say many things that will break with conventional wisdom on a whole range of topics. I'm going to say things that might appear mean, insensitive, and politically incorrect. To the extent that is true, you should feel free to raise any kind of question you want during the question-answer period. You don't have to feel as though you owe me any undue courtesy because I'm your guest. Raise hard questions. Don't worry about insulting me. I am uninsultable. The only way you could possibly insult me is to suggest that even though I've been living 1/3 of the time our country has been in existence, that I'm not pretty good in basketball. And that's a matter of ethnic pride that I take seriously. The primary justification for the growth of government far beyond what the founders envisioned for us is to promote fairness and justice. Well, that's a worthy goal, but at the same time we might ask, well, what is fairness and justice? What is the legitimate role of government in a free society? Let me spend just a few minutes discussing what the founders of our nation saw as the legitimate role of the federal government. And to do that, let's turn to the book that they gave us, or the rule book that they gave us, namely the United States Constitution. Most of what the founders saw as the legitimate role for the federal government is found in Article 1, Section 8 of the United States Constitution. And let me just briefly quote sections thereof. It says, Congress shall have the power to lay and collect taxes, duties, imposts, and excises, to pay the debts, and provide for the common defense and the general welfare of the United States. In Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution, they have the power to borrow money on the credit of the United States, to regulate commerce with foreign nations and among several states and with Indian tribes. They're also authorized to coin money, establish post office and post roads, to raise and support armies. The framers of the Constitution granted Congress taxing and spending power for these and a few other activities. Now, nowhere in the Constitution can we find authority for Congress to tax and spend for up to 3/4 of what Congress taxes and spends for today. That is, there's no constitutional authority for farm subsidies, bank bailouts, food stamps, Medicare, Social Security, and a host of other things that the United States Congress does. I think that we can safely say that we made a significant departure from the constitutional principles of individual freedom and its main ingredient, limited government. We made a significant departure from the ideas and principles that made us a rich nation in the first place. Now, these principles of freedom were embodied in our nation through the combined institutions of private ownership of property and free enterprise. Now, some people will say, well, Williams is being kind of narrow about the Constitution, because you'll hear some lawyers will tell you, well, the Constitution is a living document. Well, anybody who says the Constitution is a living document is at the same time saying we do not have a Constitution at all. Because for the rules of the game to mean anything, they must be fixed. Now, the framers gave us ways to amend the Constitution, namely through Article 5, but when somebody says we have a living Constitution, it's like saying that we don't have a Constitution. For example, how many of you would like to play me poker tonight and the rules be living? I mean, maybe under certain circumstances, my 2 pair can beat your 3 of a kind. So for the rules to mean anything, they must be fixed. Now, through numerous successful attacks, private property and free enterprise that the framers envisioned are mere skeletons of their past. Thomas Jefferson anticipated this when he said, and I quote him, "The natural progress of things is for government to gain ground and for liberty to yield." The best way of looking at this process of government gaining ground and liberty yielding is to look at what has happened to taxation and spending. Ladies and gentlemen, there's only one way to look at taxes. Taxes represent government claims on private property. Indeed, if government were to tax private property at 100%, it would confiscate private property. And indeed, taxes are going up. An even better measure of what government does is to look at what has happened to spending. Let's go back to the turn of the last century, or let's say 1902. Expenditures at all levels of government, federal, state, and local levels of government, totaled $1.7 billion. The average taxpayer that year paid $60 in federal, state, and local taxes. In fact, from 1787 until 1920, federal expenditures were only 3% of the GDP, except during wartime. Today, federal expenditures alone are close to $4 trillion, or 30% of the GDP. State and local governments, they spend close to $3 trillion. The average taxpayer today is taxed $10,000 a year in federal, state, and local taxes. Now, what's the significance of all this? Well, the significance is that as time goes by, you and I own less and less of our most valuable resource, namely ourselves and the fruits of our labor. Another way of looking at this is that the average taxpayer works from January 1st until mid or late April, depending on the state that you live, to pay federal, state, and local taxes. That means we're going on 4 months out of the year, and we do not have the rights to decide how the fruits of our labor will be used. Somebody else makes that decision. Now, keep in mind that a working definition of slavery is that you work all year, and it is someone else that makes the decision how the fruits of your labor will be used. Now, in the economic sphere, the founders thought that relatively free markets, or what is called capitalism, was the most effective social organization for the promotion of individual freedom. Indeed, capitalism is defined as a system wherein individuals are free to pursue their own interests so long as they do not violate the private property rights of others. Under capitalism or free markets, there is voluntary exchange. There are private property rights held in goods and services. Indeed, much of the original intent of the United States Constitution, as seen in the document itself and the Federalist Papers that debated the Constitution, was to bring about a climate in which this kind of social organization could occur. That is, peaceable voluntary exchange. Now, the great benefit of the free enterprise system is that through private ownership and control, it minimizes the capacity of one person to coerce another person. Additionally, the coercive powers of the state are minimized. They're restricted to the legitimate functions of the state in a free society. And what are the legitimate functions of government in a free society? Well, one legitimate function is to protect you and me from international thugs violating our private property rights. So that says that there should be national defense. Another legitimate function is to protect you and I from domestic thugs violating our private property rights. So that means that at some level of government there should be police services. Now, when I say private property rights, I'm talking about it in the broadest sense possible. That is, I am my private property. You are your private property. So violating private property rights means things like murder, rape, and theft. Other legitimate functions are those of enforcing constitutional order, the adjudication of disputes, and the provision of certain public goods as an economist would define them. Now, in order for these legitimate and constitutionally mandated functions to be carried out, each citizen is obliged to pay his share of the federal government's expenses. Now, for the last half century, free enterprise and what it implies has been under unrelenting attack in our country. Americans from all walks of life, whether they realize it or not, have demonstrated a deep and abiding contempt for personal liberty, private property rights, and economic freedom. Free enterprise is threatened today in our country, not because of its failure. It's threatened because of its success. That is, capitalism has been so successful in eliminating the traditional problems of mankind, such as disease, pestilence, hunger, and gross poverty, that all other human problems appear to us to be at once inexcusable and unbearable. The desire by many Americans to eliminate these so-called unbearable and inexcusable problems have led us away from the basic ideals and principles upon which our prosperous nation is built. In the name of other ideals, such as equality of income, sex and race balance, affordable housing, medical care, orderly markets, consumer protection, energy conservation, just to name a few, we have abandoned many personal liberties. As a result of widespread control by our government in an effort to achieve these so-called higher objectives, we're increasingly being subordinated to the point where considerations of personal freedom are but secondary and tertiary matters. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm saying that increasingly our liberties are being treated as dirt. Now you say, well, can you explain this? Well, for example, here's a question. Suppose I write to the United States Congress and I tell them, my name is Walter Williams and I am an emancipated adult. I am capable of taking care of my own retirement needs. If I fail to do so, let me go begging or die in the streets, but stop taking money out of my Social Security, out of my pay for Social Security. How do you think that would be greeted? It'd be greeted with contempt. Here are some people telling me and you how much we should set aside out of each week's pay for retirement, and if we disagree with them, we'll go to jail. What do you think how about they're telling us how much we should set aside out of each week's pay for housing, for food, for education? If they did that, then we would definitely say that's tyranny. So what's the difference? So this is what I mean when our liberties are increasingly being treated as dirt. Now, the ultimate end to this process is totalitarianism, which is nothing more than a reduced form of servitude. Now, I'm not saying that we are a totalitarian nation yet. But if you ask the question, which way are we headed, tiny steps at a time, are we headed towards more personal liberty or are we headed to more government control over our lives? It'd have to be unambiguously the latter. Now remember, if you take tiny steps towards any goal, it's just a matter of when you're going to get to that goal. Or as the great philosopher David Hume said, it is seldom that liberty of any kind is taken or is lost all at once. It's always lost bit by bit. Or my late colleague, Leonard Read, the founder of the Foundation for Economic Education, he put it even better. He said that if you wanted to take liberty away from Americans, you had to know how to cook a frog. And Leonard Read said, you cannot cook a frog by putting on a pot of boiling water and then throwing the frog in the water, because the frog's reflex is so quick that as soon as his feet hit the boiling water, he'd hop away and be free. Leonard Read said the way to cook a frog is to put on a pot of cold water, put the frog in the water, and heat it up bit by bit. And by the time the frog realized he was being cooked, it was too late. That's the same thing with Americans. If anybody came over here talking about taking away all of our liberties all at once, we would righteously rebel. But they can talk about taking away our liberties bit by bit. Now, the primary justification for the attack on private property, economic freedom, and privacy can be found in people's desire for government to do good. We all say things like, government should care for the poor. Government should take care of the disadvantaged. Government should help the elderly. Government should help failing businesses. Government should help college students and other deserving segments of our society. Well, it's all nice to say those things, but we have to recognize that government has no resources of its very own. That is what I mean by that, ladies and gentlemen. Those programs coming out of Washington or out of our state capitol, they don't represent congressmen and senators reaching in their own pockets, sending out their money. Moreover, there's no tooth fairy or Santa Claus giving them the money. So when you recognize that government has no resources of its very own, that forces you to recognize that the only way the government can give one American citizen $1 is to first, through intimidation, threats, and coercion, confiscate that dollar from some other American. Now, if you believe I'm being too loose with the terminology intimidation, threats, and coercion, you have April 15th to check me out on that. You can tell the agents of the United States Congress that you're only too willing to pay for the constitutionally mandated functions of the federal government, but you're not going to have your money going to farmers or bailing out banks and stuff like that. So you will see all the intimidation, threats, and coercion that you want to see. And if you act too ugly, you'll get shot by the agents of the United States Congress. Now, we Americans, we support government doing things that if a person did the identical thing privately, we would roundly condemn that person as an ordinary, low-down, despicable thief. Let me give you an example of that. I could see an elderly lady sleeping on a grate in downtown Philadelphia. The lady could be hungry, needs medical attention, and shelter. Now, I could walk up to Andrea with a gun in my hand. I could say, Andrea, give me your $200. Then having gotten her $200, I could go downtown and buy the lady some medical attention, some food, and some shelter. Would you find me guilty of a crime? I'd be guilty of theft, regardless of what I did with the money. Would it be theft if 2 or 3 people agreed that I should take Andrea's money? Would that change it? What about 100,000? What about 3 or 4 million agreed that I should take the money? It's still theft, because what is theft? Theft is taking the rightful property of one person and giving it to another to whom it does not belong. Now, you say, Williams, well, it's legal. Well, moral people cannot depend on legality alone to guide them. That is because there are many things in this world that are legal, but clearly immoral. That is, slavery was legal. Did that make it moral? The Nazi persecution of the Jews, Stalinist purges, they were legal. But did that make it moral? So the moral question that we're confronted with is there a moral case for taking by force the property of one person and giving it to another to whom it does not belong? Now, I have not come up with a moral case for that. Now, what the government does, as I said earlier, you and I would get arrested for doing the same thing. It's just the only difference between what the government does is when they take, when they take money, they call it welfare. It's just a matter of legality. And so we have to ask ourselves the question, should one person be forcibly used to serve the purposes of another? Is that moral, to forcibly use one person to serve the purposes of another? And I think it's immoral. Now, before I go on, I think that you find American in need, a fellow American in need, I think it is praiseworthy to help him out. That is, it is laudable to help your fellow man out by reaching into your own pockets to help him out. Reaching into somebody else's pockets to help him out, I think, is worthy of condemnation, and it's despicable. Now, in a free society, we want most, if not all, of our relationships to be voluntary, and we want to minimize involuntary exchange. Another way of looking at it, a lot of people get hung up on involuntary versus voluntary. I always like to say, instead of voluntary exchange, I always like to say, I love seduction. Any kind of seduction. Now, I know you young people, your hormones in uproar, and so you don't fully understand what I'm saying. But what's the essence of seduction? Seduction is when we proposition our fellow man in the following way, in the following fashion. We say to him, we proposition him, if you make me feel good, I'll make you feel good. Now, let me give you some examples of that. I walk into my grocer with $3 in my hand, and I proposition him. I say, if you make me feel good, give me that gallon of milk. I'll make you feel good, give you $3. And if that exchange is transacted, he's better off because he valued the $3 more than the milk, and I'm better off because I value the milk more than the $3. And we call that a positive sum game, where both parties are better off in their own estimation. Now, I'm against rape. What's the essence of rape or involuntary exchange? That occurs when we proposition our fellow man in the following fashion. We say to him, if you don't make me feel good, I'm going to make you feel bad. That's where I went to my grocer with a gun in my hand. I say, if you don't make me feel good, give me that gallon of milk. I'm going to make you feel bad, blow your brains out. Clearly, I benefit, but he loses. And we call that a zero-sum game. Now, by the way, a lot of people say, Williams, a lot of these things you complain about, represents that, we are a democracy, we're a majority, and majority rules. Well, I tell them, I don't think gang rape is any better than individualized rape. That is, just because you vote to rape somebody doesn't make it right. Or a majority consensus does not establish morality. And by the way, the framers did not intend for us to be a democracy, did they? No. The word democracy is not found in any of our founding documents. The framers of our nation had utter contempt for the idea of democracy because they argued, and you read the writings of James Madison and John Adams, they said that democracy gives an aura of legitimacy to acts that are otherwise be deemed tyranny. And you think of, is it the battle hymn of the democracy or the republic? Or do we pledge allegiance to the flag for the democracy for which it stands? I don't think so. Now widespread private ownership and control of resources is consistent with seduction and the minimization of rape. Widespread government ownership is consistent with rape maximization. That is, the essence of our relationship with government is that if we don't make them feel good, they're going to make us feel bad. An example of this was back in 1959. I was driving a taxi cab in Philadelphia, and I was making about $400 a month. And I got this letter, and the letter in effect said, Williams, we want you to stop driving a taxi and making $400 a month, and we want you to start making $68 a month. Well, people don't normally voluntarily switch in that direction. And so the proposition they were saying, giving me, is that if I don't make them feel good by being in their army, they're going to make me feel bad by putting me in jail. In other words, I was being drafted. Matter of fact, I don't even like to use the term draft. My labor services were being confiscated by the government. But we don't have a draft anymore, by the way, don't we? But you have to register for it. Right? Young guys have to register for it, sign up. And I would be worried about that because that's like somebody saying, hey, Williams, we're not going to have slavery anymore, but we want you to sign up. Yeah. I'd be a bit worried about that. Anyway, now despite the bigness and the alleged power of industrial giants like IBM, General Motors, AT&T, people say, well, because these firms are very, very big, we need a powerful government. Well, despite their bigness, what kind of power does Exxon have over you and me? Over you and me? That is, what can they force us to do? In order for Exxon to get $1 from me, what must happen? I must voluntarily get out of my chair, voluntarily get in my car, and voluntarily go to this man's lot and voluntarily hand him some money for some gasoline. What kind of power does he have over me? Big business does not have power over us. Now, I would be remiss if I didn't point out that big business can have power over us. But what do they have to do in order to get it? They have to go to the United States Congress to get permission to rip us off. Like Chrysler or General Motors. Or take the farmers. The farmers are having problems. Now, the farmers, if the farmers are having problems, they can come knock on my door. They can say, Williams, can you spare a dime? Now, I'd probably tell the farmers to go play in the traffic. And they know that. So what they'll do, they'll go to their senator, say Senator Dole when he is senator. They'll say, well, if we ask Williams to voluntarily help us out, he's going to tell us to go play in the traffic, so could you use your agents at the IRS and take his money? That's how big business can get money from us, and they're getting a lot of money from us, by the way, by getting permission from our legislators to rip us off. Now, the free market and voluntary exchange are roundly denounced by today's defenders of the new human rights, what I call the new human rights. These defenders of the new human rights are chief supporters of reduced private property rights, reduced rights to profits. They are anti-competition and pro-monopoly. They are pro-control and coercion by government. And these people in our country and around the world, they believe that they have more intelligence and superior wisdom to the masses, and they believe that they have been ordained to forcibly impose that wisdom on the rest of us. Now, of course, they have what they consider to be good reasons, but every tyrant that has ever lived believes what he was doing had a good reason. These people in our country and elsewhere, their plan requires the elimination or at least the attenuation of the market. Why do tyrants want to attack the market? Well, the market implies voluntary exchange. Tyrants do not trust that people acting voluntarily will do what the tyrant thinks that they ought to do. And so They want to replace the market with economic planning, industrial planning. Now, I'll give you a definition of economic planning that will last you the rest of your lives. It's a very simple definition. Economic planning is nothing more than the forcible superseding of somebody else's plan by the powerful elite. Let me give you an example of that. I might plan to buy a Honda motorcycle from a Japanese producer. The powerful elite will say, Williams, we're going to supersede your plan through tariffs and quotas because we think you ought to buy a Harley Davidson. Or my daughter might plan to work for the hardware store guy down the street for $4 an hour. Her mother says it's okay. I say it's okay. She says it's okay. And the hardware store guy says it's okay. But the powerful elite will say, we're going to supersede that plan because it's not being transacted at the prices we think it ought to be transacted at, namely the minimum wage. Now, they do this, many of these people are just plain evil people, but many people do all this in the name of good. But do-gooders fail to realize that most good in the world is not done in the name of good. In other words, if you were to ask me, Williams, what human motivation gets the most wonderful things done? I would say greed. I love greed. I'm not talking about ripping off people. I'm not talking about fraud. I'm not talking about getting government handouts. I'm not talking about misrepresentation. I'm talking about people trying to get as much as they can for themselves. Let me give you an example of that because you might not have thought about it this way. Take Texas cattle ranchers this winter. They might be getting up in blizzards in the middle of the night, running down stray cows, trying to feed them, maybe getting kicked by the cows, making this personal sacrifice to make sure New Yorkers have beef on their shelves. You had Idaho potato farmers getting up in the morning, doing back-breaking work, sun beating down, and dirt underneath their fingernails, bugs biting them, making this personal sacrifice to make sure New Yorkers also have potatoes on their shelves. Now, I ask you, why do you think they're doing it? Do you think they're doing that because they love New Yorkers? They may hate New Yorkers. I'm not that wild about New Yorkers myself. But they may hate New Yorkers, but they make sure that beef and potatoes gets to New York every single day of the week. Why? Because they want more for themselves. Now I ask you, how much beef and potatoes do you think would get to New York if it all depended on human love and kindness and social justice? I'd be worried about people in New York. Now, most good things get done because of self-interest and private property rights. You know, some people say, well, Williams, since you're trying to win friends and influence people, instead of saying greed, a very insensitive word like greed, why don't you say enlightened self-interest? Well, that's okay. I like greed better. Let me give you another example of the virtue of enlightened self-interest. Now, I have often said that I don't care much about future generations. And sometimes people are shocked when I say I don't care about future generations. And they're shocked and say, why? I ask, what have future generations ever done for me? I mean, some kid that's going to be born in 2050, what has he done for me? And if he has not done anything for me, how then am I obliged to do anything for him? But I point out to people, well, where I live, I have a fairly nice piece of property, and several years ago, I took some money and I bought seedlings for my property, little trees. Now, when those trees reach their full maturity, I'll be dead. There'll be some 20, 50 kids swinging in my trees, eating my apples. Mrs. Williams, when she's been deceased for about 4 years, but she built a huge, beautiful sunroom. And that sunroom, she did it with my money, by the way. And that sunroom is going to live longer than we are. There'll be some 20, 50 kid tracking mud in my sunroom, my beautiful sunroom. Well, if you ask the question, well, why did I make a sacrifice of current consumption to produce something that's going to long outlast me, that some 20, 50 kids going to enjoy? The answer is very easy. Is that the nicer my house is, the longer it will provide housing services, what? The higher the price I get when I go to sell it. That is by pursuing my own selfish interests to maximize, and use a grown-up language, the present value of the house. I can't help but make a house available for a future generation, whether I mean to or not. Now you ask, well, would I have the same set of incentives to care for the house if the government owned it? Would I have the same set of incentives if there were a 75% transfer tax when I went to sell the house? No. Whatever weakens my private property rights interests in that house weakens my incentive to do the socially responsible thing, namely conserve on the scarce resources of our society. Before I continue, let me give you just one other example. You people look like nice people. I don't know whether you're nice at all, but you could be concerned about the extinction of various species of animals. I don't give a hoot. And it's a practical matter. I mean, because according to biologists, something like 93% of everything that has ever lived on Earth is now extinct. And I say, why get in a tizzy over 93.2, 0.5, or whatever, you know? And, some people are concerned with the bald eagle becoming extinct. And I remember at the Philadelphia Zoo, I was 35 years old when I saw the first bald eagle. I was looking at the critter in the cage. And I was asking myself, could I have gone another 35 years without seeing him? And I concluded yes, but different people have different values, and I can understand it. Anyway, the point I want to make is that I was listening to NPR, this is years ago, and people were picketing the UN because they're concerned about the extinction of the great apes, or the extinction of the rhino, or extinction of the giraffe. And they're forming, Ducks Unlimited, Save the Whale clubs, things like this. So I wrote down this list of animals that the people are concerned with, and, they were in a tizzy over. So I wrote down another list of animals that are very valuable to us. And I said, how come people are not marching for the pig? How come they're not forming Save the Cow clubs, Save the Sheep clubs? Well, what's the essential difference between these two lists of animals? Well, in one list of animals, cows, pigs, and sheep, they belong to somebody. Somebody's personal private wealth is at stake. With whales and gorillas and elephants, they don't belong to anybody. Nobody's personal private wealth is at stake. So the issue, or my suggestion to you, is that if you're concerned about the extinction of various animals, you should try to privatize them. Now, despite the virtues of the free market that I've been talking about, never mind, it was with the rise of capitalism or free markets that brought about more humane societies. That is, brought about better treatment to women, to racial minorities, to the handicapped, to criminals, and the insane. There's considerable hostility towards markets. I was giving a lecture at one college, and a lady stood up and said, well, the free market and United States capitalism is hostile to women. So I asked her, I said, if you're a radical feminist, what country do you want to live in? Saudi Arabia, China, or United States? Or if you go to jail, what country do you want to go to jail in? Is it Turkey or Mexico? You want to go to jail in the United States so you don't miss your HBO shows in the afternoon. That is, And it's a whole nother lecture, but the rise of capitalism brought about a more humane society, because prior to the rise of capitalism, the way to become very, very wealthy was through looting, plundering, and enslaving your fellow man. With the rise of capitalism, it became possible to accumulate great wealth by serving your fellow man, by producing things your fellow man wanted, by pleasing your fellow man. And many people say, well, capitalism doesn't work, or free markets doesn't work. Well, I think one of the reasons why it doesn't work, many times, is because it's not allowed to work. Almost every group in our nation has come to feel that the government owes them a special privilege or a favor. And I might say conservatives are no means exempt from this practice. That is, manufacturers feel that the government owes them protective tariffs. That is, to keep foreign goods out so they can charge you and me higher prices. Farmers feel that government owes them crop subsidies. Organized labor feels that government should keep their jobs protected from those who are not union members. Intellectuals, college professors, feel that government should give them funds to do research. That is, college professors love to get funds for do research on poverty and have meetings in a nice hotel in Miami during the winter to talk about poor people. Conservatives rail against food stamps. They rail against aid to families of dependent children, legal aid, but they come out in support for aid to dependent farmers, aid to dependent banks, and aid to dependent motorcycle companies. As such, conservatives very often don't have a moral leg to stand on. They just prove that it's a matter of whose ox is being gored. That is, conservatives as well as liberals, Republicans as well as Democrats, they prove H.L. Mencken's definition of an election quite correct. For those of you who have forgotten, H.L. Mencken was he's a political satirist, and he worked for the Baltimore Sun. And somebody asked H.L. Mencken to give the definition of an election. And H.L. Mencken replied, and I'm quoting him, he said, "Government is a broker in pillage, and every election is an advance auction on the sale of stolen goods." To the extent that H.L. Mencken is correct, we've identified our problem as a nation. That is, many of us will blame politicians for our problems. And yes, we can blame politicians, but just a little bit. Ladies and gentlemen, the bulk of the problem lies with you and me, because politicians are doing precisely what people who elect them to office to do. What are they doing? They're using people elect politicians to use the power of their office to take the property of one American and bring it back to them. Now you say, Williams, that's pretty insulting. You know, we in Pennsylvania, we don't do that. Well, imagine that I'm running for the Senate in Pennsylvania, and I go back and forth across the state. And I say, my fellow Pennsylvanians, I've read the United States Constitution. I know what's in Article 1, Section 8 of the United States Constitution, and if it's not there, the federal government cannot do it. So, therefore, do not expect, if you elect me to office, do not expect for me to bring back highway construction funds. It's not in the Constitution. Don't expect for me to bring aid to higher education. It's not in the Constitution. Don't expect for me to vote for prescription drugs. It's not in the Constitution. Do you think the citizens of Pennsylvania would elect me to the Senate? No, they wouldn't. And the tragedy of it is they would be absolutely right not electing me to the Senate. Why? Because if I don't bring back all these billions of dollars for people of Pennsylvania, it doesn't mean that Pennsylvanians will pay a lower federal income tax. All that it means is that New Jersey will get it instead. That is, once legalized theft begins, it pays for everybody to participate. And those who do not participate will wind up holding the brown end of the stick. And for those of you with a rural background, you know what the brown end of the stick is. So, let me kind of conclude. by asking the question, well, what can be done? Well, ladies and gentlemen, I don't know what can be done. And sometimes people say, well, how can the United States get out of the mess that we're in, the fiscal and financial and actually moral mess that we're in? Well, I say, well, I ask them, I throw the question back on them. I say, well, is there any basic difference between Americans and other people? That is there any basic difference between American and the British or the Spanish or the French? These are great empires of the past that went down the tubes. I mean, at Queen Victoria's Jubilee in 1887, I believe, if someone had suggested that Great Britain would become a third-rate nation, challenged on the high seas by a sixth-rate nation such as Argentina, and almost lose, you would have been put into the insane asylum. It was inconceivable that Great Britain would, the mightiest nation on the face of the earth, would ever go down the tubes. Matter of fact, people who say that the sun never set on the British Empire. You know why they said that? One guy said the reason that the sun never set on the British Empire is because God couldn't trust the British in the dark. So, but I think if the founders were to come back today, they'd be disappointed in the Americans. They'd be disappointed in our choice to accept what we see as safety in exchange for liberty. But I'd also say the only optimistic note that I see, I say that it's not too late for us to wake up and do something about the erosion of our liberties. You know, one of the great things about our country is that we've never done the wrong thing for a long time. We've managed to get our act together. But I think that we have to get about the task of putting government back to what the framers intended for it to be before we lose our liberty to do so. Thank you very much, and I'll entertain any questions.
Here at Villanova. I really appreciate you being here with us today, and especially because you have actually made conservatism look modern on campus with your rendition of very hardcore libertarianism. I'd like to bring us back to the question of the founders and their principles. And I'm reminded of Lincoln and the Peoria Address, who thought he was going back to the founding to reestablish the principles of Washington, Madison, Jefferson, and so on. When he criticized Stephen Douglas, because he said that Douglas was striking at the heart of what America meant when he brought forth the idea of self-interest as a fundamental basis of what it meant to be an American. And Lincoln said, that's when you criticize the Declaration of Independence and insist there's no just principle of action but self-interest, then that is no longer America as we know it. Because what we have to emphasize instead is that the very foundation of liberty rests in a central idea. It has to do with interest, you can call it self-interest if you will, but that self-interest is always defined with a moral foundation. Madison also said this in a letter, I believe it was to Monroe, when he said, yeah, we can talk about interest and the relationship of interest to justice, but he said, it doesn't have any bearing unless you qualify interest with every necessary moral ingredient. And that moral ingredient has to do with the idea of recognizing other human beings as human beings and treating them as such. So there's a real positive moral component, I think, at the basis of liberty in America. And I wondered if you would speak to that.
I don't, I don't think that anybody would say, I don't believe you would say, that it's okay for the government to forcibly use one person to serve the purposes of another. Because indeed, that's the ultimate, that's what slavery, in fact, was, the forcible use of one person to serve the purpose of another. And so what we're talking about is degrees of that. Yeah. And I think that even before we got to where we were, Americans are the most generous people on the face of this earth. And that is, our country does, we can be quite proud of our fellow Americans, we do 80% of all world giving. And this was a characteristic of us noted way back in 1840 when Alexis de Tocqueville came here to do a study on prisons, and he went back to France and wrote Democracy in America, and where he was giving lectures in France saying, those Americans just love committees. Somebody's barn burns down, they have a committee. Somebody becomes widowed. You're talking about the generous spirit of the American people. Now, I think that for Christians among us, we should recognize that when God gave Moses the commandment, thou shalt not steal, I'm pretty sure he did not mean that thou shalt not steal unless you got a majority vote in Congress. And that's what we're doing. We're taking by force what belongs to one person, and I don't consider that moral at all.
I actually agree with you on that.
Yeah.
I just like to...
And then we'll give somebody else a chance, but I just like you quoted Madison, and I have a quote from Madison. And Madison is the acknowledged father of the Constitution, so he ought to know what's in it. Now, in 1794, Congress appropriated $15,000 to help some French refugees. And James Madison, stood on the floor of the House irate. And he said, I'm quoting here, I cannot undertake to lay my finger on that article of the Constitution which granted a right to Congress of expending on the objects of benevolence the money of their constituents. Now, if you look at the federal budget today, 2/3 to 3/4 of it is spent on the objects of benevolence. And then also Madison and others said, Jefferson said as well, that Congress there's no legitimate power for them to engage in charity.
But do you agree with Madison that America is founded fundamentally not in self-interest, but in the moral principle of freedom that has to do also with how we treat one another?
Of course. I think how we treat one another does not, what I'm saying, I think it's evil to treat one another, for me to go up and say, Andrea, I want you to help him out, and if you don't help him out, I'm going to put you in jail. If you don't willingly give up your money, I'm going to put you in jail. I think that's not treating our fellow man very well. Another question.
I was reading an article in the magazine, and he had a whole piece about how America is not a free
No, it's not.
and yeah, I just wanted to know, you used the word capitalism and you used the word free market. And he talks about cement, both those things. I think if you went around and asked about the service and that's before the speech, that's why America has the everyday capitalism. And the reason he wrote this article was because people like capitalism would, these kind of laws. And he wanted it to be done. He made more into what was slavery.
Yeah, and you're absolutely right. And I was using those terms interchangeably, but I guess we're a socialist nation.
He said corporatism specifically.
Well, corporatism, that's another way of putting it. That's like Mussolini. Yeah. And by the way, if you read, I have an article on my webpage, it's walterewilliams.com, and it's called The Great Myths of the Great Depression. And people like Mussolini praise Roosevelt on the kind of corporatism that he was promoting. And also he got compliments from the Nazi newspapers for the kind of things that he was doing in the United States. And it's kind of interesting when you think of this is, I'm taking your question a little bit further than what you asked, but if you think about it, what government's doing in our country, we went from 1787 until 1930, when during that interval we had depressions and recessions. They used to call them panics. And nobody thought that the federal government ought to intervene and take care of things, to fix things up. It wasn't until the Hoover administration, then followed by the Roosevelt administration, that decided to fix things up. And they created a set of circumstances whereby they turned what would have been a 2 or 3 year sharp downturn in the economy to an affair that had lasted for 12 years. They made things worse than they otherwise would be. And we're doing the same thing now with the stimulus package and things like this. So I think it's very, very important for us to recognize that we've moved away from a free market system. As a matter of fact, in terms of the index of economic freedom, I believe that we're 9th or 10th in the world. We've been slipping down for a number of years. Yes?
I'm a freshman business student here at Villanova, and my question for you is concerning your view towards poverty. When you said you're unwilling to depend on human love and kindness to provide New York with potatoes and meat. But then why are you willing to depend on human love and kindness to provide for the poor and disabled of our nation?
I mentioned that as well.
What is your policy towards the politicians?
Well, I think it should be charity. I think that the government handouts is it's not immoral. I mean, it's not moral. And I think that, and if you look at poor people, I think that poverty, government programs, welfare programs, have done things to poor people that would have been otherwise impossible to happen. For example, for black Americans, the welfare state has done to black Americans what slavery could not have done, what the harshest Jim Crow laws could not have done, namely to virtually destroy the black family. And when I say that, you point out that only 30% of black kids live in two-parent families today, whereby in the 1880s and the early 1900s, up to 85% lived in two-parent families. Even during slavery, when slaves were not allowed to marry, most black kids grew up with mother and fathers in the house, much more to a greater extent today. And so the welfare state has been very destructive of the ambition of people. And I might also say that the welfare state is destructive of white people too. That is, the illegitimacy rate among blacks is around 72% now, and among whites is around 30%. And 30% was the illegitimacy rate in 1960 among blacks. And so the welfare state has been very destructive. In Sweden, which is kind of the mother of welfare states, illegitimacy is 54% in Sweden. And so I think that I'm somewhat like Reverend Ike. He was a minister, a lot of fun. But he says the best thing you can do for poor people is not join them. And I've been working my life trying not to be with poor people. Yeah.
Hi, Dr. Williams. I'm an admirer of your work and I'm inclined to agree with most of what you say, but I have one hesitation, and it's not about something you said here tonight, but something you wrote a long time ago that I read in an article about don't confuse what is with what should be, wherein you said, normative statements are excellent tools for tricking others into doing what you want them to do. I simply caution that in the process of tricking others, there's no need to trick oneself into believing that one normative statement is better or more righteous than another. And as I understand it tonight, your discussion about the legitimate role of government is nothing but a series of normative statements, as you would call them. So if all normative statements are the same, or none are better than another, can you persuade me, if you will, or seduce me? Why would I believe your account over whatever the opposite would be?
Because my account is better. Now, when I talk about normative versus non-normative statements in class, I'm saying that I'm talking about economic theory. And that you should always recognize the difference between objective and subjective statements, because with subjective statements you can argue forever, but not with objective statements. And I was pointing out that, for example, I was telling students, a lot of people will say, oh, I just need a telephone. Well, what kind of statement is that? That's normative, isn't it? Very subject, because you have to prove to me that you need a telephone, a cell phone. And I tell the students, I say, look, George Washington managed to defeat the mightiest nation on the face of the earth, and he didn't have a cell phone, nor an automobile. So you don't really need it. And I was telling the students, well, look, I'm not telling you to purge your vocabulary of needs and these normative statements, because using normative statements is a good way to trick people into doing what you think they ought to do. But in terms of economic theory, we want to keep in mind, at least in my class, that we're only talking about positive statements. As a matter of fact, I tell the students the first day of class, I tell them that if you find me saying in class anything that sounds like a normative statement and I don't first say, in my opinion, you should raise your hand and say, Professor Williams, I am not taking your course to listen to your opinions, because your opinions are no better than those of the man in the insane asylum. That is, I'm not here to proselytize. I tell the students, I'm not here to proselytize students, because I think that's academic dishonesty. But I love being in a forum like this, because I can make all kinds of normative statements. In my classroom, I don't. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Anthony. I was wondering, how do you stop these slow steps towards totalitarianism?
Totalitarianism. Right, okay.
Well, how do you put into action?
Well, I mean, the founders of our nation found a very good way. They just rebelled against the crown, the mightiest country on the face of the earth. They just rebelled. Huh?
So you think that we
No, I don't know. I'm just telling you what the founders did. And if you read on my website, I have a bunch of quotes about what the founders said about the right to keep and bear arms. And they said they gave us the Second Amendment not so that we could go duck or deer hunting. They explicitly said they gave us the Second Amendment, the right to keep and bear arms, to protect ourselves against the United States Congress, to protect ourselves against government. And our founders were very, very radical people. They would be very disappointed with you today, how compliant we are. But see, it's more of your problem, because, as I said, I've been living 1/3 of the time our country has been in existence, and I probably won't be living another third of it. And so it's your problem, because, I'll be dead when things really get bad. And I'll be looking down in heaven at you guys.
Robert Miller, I'm a member of the faculty at the law school. My question concerns government response to the financial crisis of 2007, 2008. You said a couple of times that you disapprove of bank bailouts that the government did in farm and otherwise. One aspect of most financial crises in which financial institutions are failing on a scale is the sharp contraction of the money supply. Even libertarians like Milton Friedman think that the government should have a role in controlling the money supply. So my question is, if you had controlled the Federal Reserve, or you controlled fiscal policy in 2007, 2008, responding to the financial crisis, especially worried about the contraction of the money supply, what would you have done?
Well, I wouldn't have done what they did.
We had QE1 and QE2, and this quantitative easing of money, which in other words is counterfeiting. Matter of fact, I've often suggested to people, if you're ever on trial, you're ever in front of a judge charged with counterfeiting, just tell him that you were engaging in monetary policy. But I think that companies failing, failing is just as important as success in a market. Making profits and making losses. They act as signals. Now, a lot of the problems that the financial institutions had, they were a direct result of Congress, particularly the Community Reinvestment Act, forcing lending and financial institutions to grant mortgages to people that they otherwise would not grant mortgages to. And all the problems, the secondary problems that arose with that. And I think that the idea that some companies are just too big to fail, that's a mistake. I think that there are several theories that you can look at failure. You can look at one as being the domino effect. That's the idea that, well, gee, if we let all these places fail, they will all go knock each other down like dominoes. But there's probably really a popcorn effect. That is where you heat popcorn and you see one kernel popping does not make all the others pop. It's the heat that's making them pop. And so we were looking at the problem incorrectly, I believe. And then I was if you look at the Federal Reserve, and they're in charge of handling the money since 1913 with the Federal Reserve Act. And I was just saying to this evening, prior to talk, that if you look at the Federal Reserve Act and you say, well, let's look at bank failures before and after, there were a greater number after the Federal Reserve Act, and price stability was greater before the Federal Reserve Act. And if you look at the Great Depression, again, that was precipitated by the Federal Reserve, inappropriate monetary policy that Milton Friedman and Anna Schwartz wrote about. So, yeah, and
thank you for coming out tonight. Just a quick question. Forget Congress or anything. If you were president, what tax laws would you do, impose, or change to get to this free society?
Well, probably if I were fortunate enough to become president, and a lot of people recommend that or they say, well, gee, Williams, why don't you throw your hat in the political ring? And I tell people, well, look, I'm very flattered by that, but in order to become president or get to higher political office in this country, I would have to somehow rise above principle and do the right thing. And I'm not ready for such a heady trek. But there are a number of things. Spending is authorized by Congress. Only Congress can tax and spend, according to the Constitution. But a president does have the power. Like, I think one of the things that I would propose to the incoming president is to repeal every single executive order that is fully within the power of the president. And there are many executive orders that are raising havoc with our economic system and social welfare. But that's what I would do. Yeah.
Hi, my dad is actually a huge fan of yours, so what I'd say right now might break his heart a little, but I was just curious. You talked a lot about how you really want the capital system, I think, to be less limited, but I think if you look at any sort of history, and you study U.S. history, I'm concerned, you look at the Chicago Sugar Factory fire, and the way that regulated capitalism has really been a bad thing. I don't know, how would you respond to that? Because if you look at the way, even the way colonialism, imperialism, and capitalism have really left the developed countries in a lot worse of a state than the people who
I think your observations are exactly wrong. And let me tell you, look, if you say, well, what people are the richest people on the face of this earth? It's people who live, I mean, if you made a continuum, you say, look, let's rank countries according to whether they're at the free market end of the economic spectrum, towards the capitalist end, or towards the socialism end. You rank countries according to the economic system. Then you go to the UN and get data and rank countries according to per capita income. And then you go to Freedom House or International Amnesty, then rank countries according to human rights protections. What do you see? You see that the countries that tend towards the free market end, they are the richest people and they have the greatest human rights protections. The countries towards the communist or socialist end, they are the poorest countries, with the fewest human rights protections. And so yeah, capitalism is no utopia. I mean, we're going to have to wait until we go to heaven to get into a utopia. But if you say, what's the best system on earth? It turns out that it's the free market system or systems that tend towards capitalism. Or if you ask the next question, people all around the world, if they were free to leave their country and come to another country, what would that country be? Probably the United States.
But is there a reason the United States is the most powerful and the most rich?
Because we're the freest.
But because of capitalism, which came on the back of exploiting people and their resources.
Well, I mean, I think that the Chinese and the Russians exploited people far more. You know, there's an excellent book by Hummel that you should read, and it's called Death by Government. And he points out that the 20th century was the most brutal century in mankind's history. About 172 million people have been slaughtered by their own governments. Now, which governments do you think it were?
Russia.
Huh? Russia? No, but that's not the king.
The Soviet Union.
No.
Did not.
China's. Mao Zedong is responsible for the estimated slaughter or leading to the deaths of 65 million people. Stalin is around something 45 million. Hitler is a piker with 18 million.
But but you can't compare China and the Soviet Union. I mean, there's a disproportionate change in population size between the Soviet Union.
But you're asking the question. You say, well, what country do you want to go to be the freest and the richest?
I know, but I'm just saying, you say that no regulation is the best, but the United States is regulated now.
Of course.
Well, and that came for a reason.
Yeah, because what people do, they use the government to rig the market, to get things they cannot get through the market. And going back to colonialism, a lot of people say, well, colonialism is the cause of poverty. That is utter nonsense. That is, you ask the question, well, what's the richest country in the face of the earth? And was it a colony at one time? It was the United States, right? What about Canada? What about Australia, New Zealand, Hong Kong? They were all colonies. And matter of fact, some of the poorest nations were never colonies, such as Nepal.
But there are different types of countries, too. There are different colonial systems. You have to make that.
I think some people will say, well, what accounts for our riches is the huge natural resources that we have. Well, natural resources cannot explain riches, because if you look around the world, the two most natural richest continents are Africa and South America. And they are home to the world's most miserably poor people. The countries that have no natural resources, such as Hong Kong, it has to even import water. And it is the second richest political jurisdiction in the Far East.
But the richest country in the world is Qatar, and they are rich because of their natural resources.
Oh, no. That's because of oil, and they're dividing a number of people into it. But anyway.
I agree to disagree, but thank you.
Okay, you're welcome, yeah. Okay, we have two more questions, or three more, and then we have to quit. Yeah. I don't have a pick for a person. Matter of fact, I was explaining that I haven't even looked at the candidates debate any more than 4 minutes. I probably caught the total debate of 4 minutes, and that was because I could not find the remote to change the channel. So I don't listen to them at all, and from what I read about them. I don't see a whole lot of difference between any of them. And if there is a difference, it would be Ron Paul, but he doesn't have a chance of making it.
You don't think?
No way in the world.
Thank you.
Yeah. Yes. And then that fellow's final. Yeah.
I'm Ben Brendel. I'm a freshman business student here. In your presentation, you said that each man has to pay his share. I was just wondering what you would classify each man's share. Is that how should that work? Should the more wealthy pay more and the less wealthy pay less, or what is your opinion on that? And
Number of people into the federal budget and send out a check of equal size. Because, and you say, well, you take a person, a very, very wealthy person, who pays $1 million a year in taxes, federal taxes. What is he getting that a person who only pays $5,000, what is he getting? Nothing, and so why should he be paying so much? Well, yes, I think so. What you might say, taxes represent the cost of government. It's the price of government. Would you charge a wealthy person, let's say going away from government, would you charge them a higher price for gasoline or for a suit or for a car? Would you base his price? Pardon me?
You can't really compare government to gasoline. I think you realize you do need government.
Yeah.
I mean, you can't live without gasoline.
Right.
And
But
the government has a responsibility to each individual person. And if someone is better off, the government doesn't need to help them out as much as someone else.
But I know, but the government should not be in the business, at least according to the Constitution of the United States, should not be in the business of helping anybody out. The government should, it should enforce the rules of the game. It's like an umpire at a football game, the ref at a football game. Should he help out any team or should he call the rules? Should he say, hey, the Eagles had a bad year this year, and they're playing the New York Giants. Well, I'm not going to, holding. I'm not going to call that too much against the Eagles because they had a bad year. I mean, you would have contempt for a ref like that, wouldn't you? Well, that's what government is. The government is the empire. No, it's the umpire. Its job is enforcing the rules of the game, unbiased the rules of the game. Yeah.
My name is Steve Well. I'm a senior accounting major. Kind of viewing on the tax question, about this one. With government spending clearly out of control, would you recommend auditing the government federal reserve? How would you personally control government spending and get it back
I don't think you could. I mean, if the government, if Congress were to obey the United States Constitution, it would get in control because they wouldn't be doing all the things that they're doing now. Or have a spending limitation amendment to the United States Constitution. That the federal government, matter of fact, I worked with Milton Friedman, Bob Bork, and this back in 1978, and a number of very distinguished economists, Bill Niskanen and James Buchanan, and we wrote a spending limitation amendment to the United States Congress, spending limitation amendment to the United States Constitution, and it was shepherded through the Senate by Senator Lugar, and actually in 1982, the Senate voted and passed the spending limitation amendment, but the House of Representatives, Tip O'Neill, would not bring it to the floor. And in 1986, when it was introduced again, it didn't even pass the Senate. And what our amendment said is that the federal government is limited to 18%. The spending could not exceed 18% of the GDP. And we had a lot as a matter of fact, the amendment is in the back of it's in the appendix of Milton Friedman's Free to Choose book. And a lot of people were asking me, or some news people were asking me during some of the news press conferences we had, because I was pushing for a 10% limit on federal spending. And so one news guy asked me, well, how come you say a 10%? And I said, well, if 10% is good enough for the Baptist Church, it ought to be good enough for the United States Congress. That was my vision of it. Look, folks, thank you very much for coming out.